Hello, BookTube. Well, as you've seen in recent videos of mine, I was released. I was released like the Kraken. I was confined to one room here at Hyde Cottage, basically, during the worst of that monstrous heat wave that we had for last week, where I think it was Monday or maybe early Tuesday, the temperature went up into the mid-90s Fahrenheit and just stayed there for 5 days. That mass has changed. That has shifted. That weather has moved away. It's still mid-August, so it's not going to be cold, but it's no longer oppressive, and that freed me. This morning was actually cool. The Bean and I went out unaccustomedly early this morning at 6, and it was cool to walk around. And I had errands to do and appointments to do, and a lot of them had been postponed because it was just impossible to go outside. You risk heat stroke. So I went out. I went out and did those things this morning. I did quite a few of those things, and one of the things was to go to the Brattle Bookshop in downtown Boston, where I hadn't been because of the heat. There was a different thing when we would have heat waves in Boston, but I was already working at the bookstore up the street from the Brattle. That was different, right? Because I was already there. I was already miserable at the time. Heat made me miserable. So at lunch, I would just walk up to the Brattle and browse anyway, and it was no big deal. But if it's boiling hot and I work from home and I'm worried that my little dog is going to overheat or be miserable if I'm gone, I just sort of took the week off. So I had a lot of little bits and pieces stacked up, and I did all of those, and I rewarded myself with a trip to the Brattle, and I got a stack of books, and I want to show them to you. And some of them, it's a weird combination of newer stuff and older stuff. And the newer stuff, a lot of it we have seen on this channel, which is just, it's an endemic hazard. We went years and years, not so much after COVID, but we went years and years with me showing you 10, 15 new books a day. I was getting a tub load of books in the mail every day. It stands to reason that if I re-encounter those books, they will be things that we saw on this channel as well. But that won't preclude buying them, because a lot of times I would get a new book, I would get the advanced copy, then I would get the finished copy. I would review the finished copy. I would hold on to the finished copy for a while, and then I would think, I don't know. It's the new copies, the new books here are always the most vulnerable. If you can survive a year, you can probably survive 2 years. But if I'm in a culling frame of mind, I've got a pile of books going that I'm growing on the kitchen floor, I'm going to look at the new books. And that, I admit, that is not a thing to do. That often results in misjudgments. That often results in mistakes that I regret, that I feel like I need to make do on. And I found I had the ability to make do on quite a few of those today. But the first one is not new. The first one is old, and it's from the UK. I believe this is from Australia. Sphere paperbacks. This is from decades and decades ago. It's just Irish Portraits is what it's called. It's just 14 short stories by Liam O'Flaherty, who is an Irish author who's one of the great short story writers. I've mentioned a few times that I think the short story is the quintessential Irish art form. Aside from conversation. I should say written art form. I should say written art form. We are better than anybody at spoken conversation. Better than anybody. But if we're going to talk about written forms of art, I think the short story is, you would be hard-pressed to find an Irish writer who isn't great at writing short stories. I would even tend to almost give that to James Joyce. You'd be hard-pressed to find an Irish writer who isn't great at short stories, and you'll be hard-pressed to find, I would say it's virtually impossible, to find an Irish short story writer whose short stories are worse than some other nationality. I don't think that really happens. I can read Irish short stories until the cows come home. and this is no exception. I got this because it was $1, and because it was really pretty, and because I have a sweet spot for non-US paperbacks. I tend to like their design. I tend to like just the look of them on the shelf and whatnot. This is really a placeholder. I will certainly read a few things in here, or maybe all of them, but this is a placeholder because what I really want is a nice, big, thick, complete short stories of Liam O'Flaherty. That's what would be ideal. I love this author. I love all of his contemporaries when it comes to short stories. I would like big, fat volumes of all of them. And I don't think, off the top of my head, I don't remember that I've ever seen a big, fat, 1,000-page book of Liam O'Flaherty short stories, at least in America. So I grabbed this when I saw it for $1. I was, of course, going to grab it. This next one was also $1, and it is going to go on the new bookcase for books about books, literary studies, prefaces, publishing life, publishing memoirs, that sort of thing. I've taken you through the soap opera of the bookcase that immediately crowded out here in this room. It's a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. It immediately became too crowded for those books because I love them. They're one of my favorite kinds of things to read. I have lots of them. I'm not going to not get them because I don't have room for them. But that's all going to be fixed as Operation Harrigan proceeds. Okay? Operation Harrigan is a top-to-bottom, soup-to-nuts re-envisioning of my physical book collection. It requires, there are steps that have to be done, and they have to be done in the right order. I need maneuvering room before I can even begin Operation Harrigan, which means I need to cull the books on these shelves and make an enormous sale pile to the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston to get rid of books. I want to get rid of the equivalent of 2 whole bookcases full of books. So 200 or 300 books. I want to get rid of that many. I'm close to it, but I do a little more every day. I stopped during last week. I stopped doing anything last week. Last week was so bad that in the afternoon, if I'd gotten up and said, okay, well, I want to go through 5 or 6 bookcases and cull books and bring them into the kitchen to the sale pile, if I had done that, in 15 minutes, I would have been running rivers of sweat, and I would have been completely exhausted and panting, and I would have needed to recover for an hour in air conditioning. When it's a heat wave, you just can't do anything like that. Now the heat wave is over, Operation Harrigan is back in full swing. And so I'm not worried about getting books of this kind. I'm not worried at all, tra-la-la, because I'm going to have all the room in the world. Once I have re-envisioned my book collection, I'm going to have all the room in the world. So I got this, and it's, what do the kids say? Problematic? I've had this book before, and I remember enjoying it, but I can't stand the author. Just can't stand the author. But this is a big, fat collection of the kind of things I'm talking about. It's a huge amount of book reviews in here, a huge amount of book essays, a very long, standalone, I won't call it an essay even, it's more like a standalone work on Thomas Hardy. And this is D.H. Lawrence. This is a posthumous collection of his works called Phoenix. There was also a Phoenix 2, but this is a UK Penguin trade paperback and this white spine. And it was $1, so I grabbed it because I don't have it, and it is kind of a classic. It represents all of that kind of work by D.H. Lawrence. Much of which was done in occasional venues, dashed off, part of a book, the back of a book, the front of a book, part of a periodical that folded. Took a huge amount of work on, Edward MacDonald is a massive D.H. Lawrence fan, a bibliographer of the author. Took a huge amount of work to get this all into one volume, and I respect that. And I do like a lot of the stuff that's in here. The only hesitation you hear in my voice is that this author is so bad. His novels, for which he is revered, no one knows that he wrote this, but his novels, he's revered for novels, and the novels are just awful. And, they're not even a case of being awful in the sense of the way I would use that word with a whole bunch of other 20th century authors, where I don't like the books, where I think, stylistically or plot-wise, rhetorically or character-wise, they're repulsive or incomplete or pretentious. Lawrence's novels are all of those things, but they're also poorly written, and I mean just simple demotic mistakes. I don't understand how they get past the critical apparatuses of the readers who are his fans. I don't get that. To me, that's a whole nother level of deal breaker, when a writer can't write a good paragraph without repeating himself. Just artlessly, obviously, unintentionally repeating himself. That sort of thing, I see that kind of demotic, line-by-line, sort of mechanical imperfections, ineptitude, where the author just doesn't seem to know what he's doing. I see that a lot in Lawrence, and it prevents me from liking his novels. I actually, some of you will howl at this, that's also all throughout Faulkner. And I just, in addition to how vile and hypocritical and cry in your beer, stupid sentimental the rest of Faulkner is on other levels, I also just I can't completely overlook that in Faulkner's books, that they are technically bad. In addition to being bad on every other level, they're also technically bad. And Lawrence is the same way. He's worse. So I've never been able to get around that, but with this stuff, I don't have to worry about that, because unlike the novels, especially once he became a cause celeb, notorious, This stuff was all went through the heavy hand of an attentive editor at literary journals, the back of the book or the front of the book, a literary journal, the book section of a newspaper, isn't going to care so much that you're D.H. Lawrence. They're going to want your prose to flow from one sentence to the next. And I think it shows. Good Lord, I think it shows. Same thing with Lawrence's travel writing. It doesn't read anything like the ineptitude of his fiction. I know you're going to say, some of you are going to say, well, naturally you're saying that because you don't like fiction. You don't like the made-up stories. So, of course, you're going to say his nonfiction is better. But I honestly think it reads different. I mean, try it yourself. Read something of his. I hate to ask you to read some of his fiction, but maybe you like it. And then read his nonfiction. Even if you don't agree the nonfiction is better, I think you'll agree that it reads completely differently. More controlled. Anyway, this is a great big thing. I haven't read any parts of Phoenix. I didn't see Phoenix 2. But I haven't read any parts of Phoenix in years and years and years. So that'll be a lot of fun. Then this next one is an example of what I was talking about for new. But I checked, and this did not come through my hands. The Brattle had to have gotten this from another book reviewer. And I got this, I read it, I kind of sort of liked it, I reviewed it, and then I got rid of it. And I've been thinking about parts of it, not the whole. It doesn't succeed as a whole novel. Almost nothing written in the 21st century does. But this is we saw it on this channel, this is by Caterina Bonvicini, and this is The Year of Our Love. Very striking cover, very nice cover, a very odd example of an American cover that looks good. This is a story of a young boy and a young girl in Italy who grow up, and it's the story of their life. I don't want to say together. They grow up together as children, but then their lives take different paths, and they are from different socioeconomic strata. And their lives keep touching again. They keep intertwining over time. It's more ambitious than the author can really pull off, and the writing is a little bit drab, but there are parts of it that have stuck with me. So I was glad to find a copy, a perfect example of the Brattle being an arena for second chances. Then this next one, I don't know about this next one. I don't know quite what this is. I couldn't pass it up. I think this was $3. I couldn't pass it up. This is new. And this is by Daniel Scherson, and it's called A True History of the United States. As you can see, True History of the United States. Now let me give you the subtitle. Indigenous genocide, radicalized slavery, hyper-capitalism, militarist imperialism, and other overlooked aspects of American exceptionalism. So this is going to be Howard Zinn 2.0, Howard Zinn on steroids. This is going to be the author 1619ing the whole of American history, saying it's all iniquitous, it was all horrible, there was never any good to it whatsoever, that America is not only an evil country and always has been, but the most evil country in the history of the world. And I can take that. I can definitely take that, especially if the book is going to teach me things, if the author's perspective, if his insight is going to teach me things, then I can take that. I don't particularly like it. You don't have to be, as I find myself needing to say so often in the 21st century, you don't have to be Twitter. Life isn't Twitter. You don't have to go 0 to 7,550 on every subject all the time without ever any nuance, gray areas, or subtlety. You don't have to be Twitter in real life. You don't have to be Twitter even on Twitter. It is very fashionable to import the all or nothing, scorched earth, zero-sum, diseased mentality of Twitter to the real world and say if a thing has ever had a bad thing, if it's ever had included a bad thing, then everything even connected with it is not only bad but the worst thing ever. That's Twitter. That's Twitter thinking. That's social media thinking. And if this is an example of that goes on for a no small amount of time, I can live with it. If the author gives me some insights, I can live with it. And I will just keep to myself. I don't think I think this is a 2021 release, but I don't think I'll be reviewing it. I would keep to myself the usual observations, the usual caveats to Daniel Scherson, S-J-U-R-S-E-N. I'll keep my usual caveats to myself about your grandparents. Daniel, tell me about your grandparents. Did they come here from some other country? Betting they did. Are they glad they did? Were they glad they did? Did they find a lot of opportunity that they fled from places that didn't have? How about you? You're writing a 1,000-page screed against America. Could you do that in other countries quite so freely? Could you do that in a lot of the countries that I bet you admire? Uh, could you expect to prosper by it? It's an impossible losing game in 2021 to stick up for the United States of America in any way. It's an impossible losing game. The social media will never show you anything good. It will only show you horrible things, and it will continuously show you horrible things to the point where it seems not only recherché, but demented to say that there's anything good about this country or ever has been. Which is why I don't get on my soapbox and say it. But nevertheless, my own family was certainly not the only family in the history of America as a country that really benefited from all the things that America offers. Yes, there are injustices. Yes, there are bad things. Yes, there is genocide. Yes, there is racism. Yes, there is sexism. Yes, there is now late-stage capitalism. Anyway, I'll give it a try. I'm always up for a screed, even if I don't agree with it. I've spent most of my life trying to convince young men between the ages of 18 and 25 that if they're going to read A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, maybe don't have the whole text tattooed on your back. Maybe read some other people's histories of the same period to maybe see if maybe you're getting fed a undergraduate outrage bill of goods by a guy who liked to stoke undergraduate outrage. If I have to do that again with this book, I'm at least well practiced at it. Then we have a biography. I've read this biography. I really liked it. I'm well up for reading it again. I'm ready to read it again. And it has a neat design. The design's going to need some reinforcing because it's a kind of gatefold cover, and those are a mistake. Just a mistake down the board. This is by Lisa Jardine. A lot of you will know her. She does great work. Just fantastic work. She's a fantastic historian. And this is her biography of Robert Hooke. The Curious Life of Robert Hooke. And I love this design. There you have Hooke's eye. But this is the design. It's not a full dust jacket. It's like this half thing that's wrapped around the book. And that has a cutout for the eye. Now the cutout is the problem here, as you can see, right? Because these things don't live on bookstore shelves. And they don't live on your personal shelf either. But Robert Hooke was a fascinating figure. Just fascinating. There was hardly an aspect of the burgeoning life of the 17th century that he didn't have an interest in. And they didn't do pioneering work in. He came from nothing. He was... I believe he was born very poor. The impression I get is that he came from nothing, that he grew up poor. He made an enormous amount of money surveying and sort of doing architectural planning in the wake of the Great Fire of London. Him and Christopher Wren, his friend Christopher Wren, basically reimagined London. And they got rich as Croesus while they were doing it. But he was involved, as you can tell from this cover, he was involved in all kinds of things. Microscopic fossils. The microscope. A whole bunch of other things too. Needless to say, there are parts of any story of Robert Hooke that I'm going to need to hold my nose at. There's a lot of dog torturing that goes on at this time. It was very fashionable to torture dogs for the cause of science. But I remember loving this book anyway. And I saw it at the Brattle this morning and realized I didn't have a copy. And it's a gem of a book. I definitely want to have it. So it was dirt cheap, so I grabbed it. Now this next one is science fiction. This is a science fiction anthology to remind you of New World's November, a booktube event that is hoovering onto the horizon. It's not here, it's not anywhere near, but it is getting closer all the time. New World's November is a science fiction event. Myself and a bunch of other booktubers are celebrating science fiction, and we are choosing for 2021 to celebrate short stories. To celebrate the science fiction short story. So you're going to hear a lot of anthologies are going to get talked about, a lot of short stories. So when I see them, especially for cheap, I'm grabbing science fiction anthologies. And this is one by Robert Silverberg. Robert Silverberg and Karen Haber did a series called Universe. The Universe anthologies. Not to be confused with Terry Carr's Universe anthologies from decades before. These are more modern. These are from 1990s. I remember selling some of these in bookstores, but I had no idea they came in trade paperback size. Well, that was awesome. This is Universe 2 in a trade paperback. That's what they look like. I think this is the only Universe anthology that I have. I read them all the way up into double digits, I believe. But I don't think I have any of them anymore. I think this is the only one that I'm going to have, and I'm happy to read through it. I seem to recall that Silverberg used to talk about these things as pointing to the rising stars of science fiction. And unlike Terry Carr also said, Terry Carr was an earlier editor, I believe one of the great science fiction editors of all time. And he, in his anthologies, Universe, not only that, but also Year's Best Science Fiction, he also used to say offhandedly that he was looking at the rising stars of science fiction. Don Walheim also said the same thing, and even Gardner Dozois. And the proof is in the pudding, right? When an editor says that, what you want to do is go back 20 years to the first time that they said that about spotting the rising stars of science fiction, and see if they were right. See how you can tell how good their instincts were by going back and looking to see if how many of the names on their table of contents actually did go on to rise as stars in science fiction. I seem to remember Silverberg not being good at it, which doesn't really surprise me, because he himself was a rising star in science fiction and then became a grand poobah. It seems to me they would be the least qualified to spot it. I don't know why that is. Who have we got here? Mark Tiedemann, Carrie James, John Gibbons, Deborah Wessel, Alex Jeffers, Tony Daniel, Donna Farley, Kathy Koja, Paula May, Dirk Strasner, Jamil Nazar, Lisa Mason. There's another Alex Jefferson, or two Alex Jefferson here. Let me name you some other names from this table of content, just so that some of the science fiction people out there can start to nod a little in recognition. In addition to those names, who were the fruit of Robert Silverberg trying to pick the rising stars in the genre, we also have Brian Aldiss, we have Barry Malzberg, Sean McMillan, Joe Haldeman, Jonathan Latham. So an uneven anthology, something that I'm sure that I've read this. We'll see. We'll see. I'll read it. I'll start at the front, and we'll see how many stories I need to go in before I suddenly think, I remember this. I have to confess, the titles on the table of contents didn't ring any bells at all, but I'm terrible about that sort of thing. So I'm terrible with titles and authors. Not a thing you'll usually hear with a book critic, but nevertheless, I am. So I'm gonna start at the beginning. I'm not gonna jump around. I'm gonna start at the beginning and see how long it takes for the book to ring some bells. Then we have something that is new. I believe this is also a fairly new release. It's a debut novel. It's by Eric Nguyen, and it's Things We Lost to the Water. Another very distinctive American cover. I don't know what's going on here. A stunning debut novel about an immigrant Vietnamese family that settles in New Orleans and struggles to remain connected to one another as their lives are inextricably reshaped. And I read this as a NetGalley ebook, but I haven't read. I don't think I've read it again. I think I read it once and was kind of impressed. Bits and pieces. It doesn't work as a novel, of course. It doesn't work as a novel. It's autofiction. And it also doesn't have any kind of conclusion, because autofiction doesn't, right? You're writing it. So the story hasn't ended. Since we're all doomed to have, in the American market, all new fiction be autofiction, then we must say goodbye to the idea of being really satisfied by the ending of a novel. It'll be something that we tell our grandkids used to happen. But they won't even know to expect it, because it'll all be autofiction. And yet, I remember there were stretches of this that I liked, so it's worth a reread, especially since it was cheap. Same thing is true with this next one. This next one I read the advanced copy, and then I read the finished copy. I wrote a review, and then I got rid of it. And I didn't want to. I don't know why I did, but this is Stephen Budiansky's life of Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great Supreme Court Justice, the great writer and thinker, great New Englander. I've read Honorable Justice and Yankee from Olympus, two great biographies of this figure, but I've also read a ton of American histories where he crops up. And he also crops up in biographies of William Howard Taft. He was a member of the Taft Court. I liked this book very much, and yet the minute I saw it at the Brattle today, I realized that I had got rid of my own copy. I don't know why. So I grabbed it. I grabbed it again. I checked. This is not my copy, but I'm glad to have it again. Same thing with this next one, which I saw, immediately knew that I didn't have and want. This is by John Gertner And we've seen it on this channel. We saw that the Wendell Holmes book on this channel. I'm sure we did. And I'm sure we saw this book as well. This is The Ice at the End of the World. His study from 2019, I believe, of the Greenland ice shelf, which contains a quadrillion tons of water, a quadrillion gallons of water. I wonder if this will tell me. 3 quadrillion tons of ice are in the Greenland ice shelf. And I think this came out in 2019. Yeah, this came out in 2019, and I read it then. I thought it was utterly fascinating. Really, really well done. There's a lot of historical analysis in here, intermixed with a lot of climatological analysis that is now completely outdated. Even though this book just came out just a few years ago, it's completely outdated now. The Greenland ice shelf is almost gone. This planet, the third planet from the sun in this solar system, barely has frozen polar regions anymore. It barely has ice caps anymore. By the time this book has its 10th year anniversary, there will be no ice caps on Earth. Antarctica will be another continent. It won't be an inhospitable place. It will have seasons. It will have floral growth. Who knows what else? In just the little amount of time since this book came out, radical climate change has passed its tipping point. For the last year, a huge chunk of Siberia, the coldest region of Siberia, has been on fire. The permafrost in the melting of the planet's 3 major glacial systems has reached a point where it cannot be reconstituted, where even 10 years of really cold weather would not bring it back to what it was. It's kind of sobering. It's great. It's a really useful, unavoidable reminder to look at this thing and realize, okay, well, there is a yardstick that you can use here. This book came out in 2019, and that's already badly antiquated. The climate shift that is talked about in this book is enormously more advanced than it was when it was talked about in this book. Enormously. The difference is not that you're looking back at this book from 70 years in the future. You're looking at this book from 3 years in the future, and the differences are fantastically great. I'm sure that will make this a weird experience to reread, but I wanted to have it. I, again, don't know why. Maybe I sent a copy to one of you, but I got rid of my copy, so I was happy to find it again. And then we have something that I have never owned. I've never actually, we'll finish up with this. I've never actually owned this book. I sold 1 million copies of this in the 90s. 1 million copies. This is an oversized book. I try to be very chary about oversized books at the Brattle. Typically, I get them because of the ooh and ah factor, and then they just sit here because they're oversized, so they're not convenient to really handle or use or anything like. You can't take them on a commute anywhere. You just have to sort of. They're coffee table books, but I don't have a coffee table. But as soon as I saw this at the Brattle, I realized, you've never owned a copy of that, and selling it is not the same thing as examining it. I never took home a copy of the book to examine when I was selling it all those years. I want to examine it because it's right at the heart of my favorite place. This is Cityscapes of Boston by Robert Campbell and Peter Vanderwarker. An American city through time. So there you have, the cover is sort of an indication of what the book does, where it shows you a before and an after picture of the same locations. There is Old Salem Street. Doesn't look anything like that, except you'll notice the buildings. And in that old picture, the merchants are showing you an old picture of Salem Street. You could do this again. You could do this 3 ways out, where someone shows you this picture with that picture in it of Salem Street the way it looks today. And that runs throughout here. And of course, the irony of this book is that Boston hasn't stopped changing. This book came out at the heart of the start of a huge urban renewal project called the Big Dig. Boston for a long time was just an ordinary city, and then rapacious land developers convinced the city council that you needed to run an elevated superhighway right through the middle of the city on elevated tracks, and with sprawling adjacent architecture everywhere. I guess it was a good idea at the time, or it might have looked it on paper. It made the whole city look ugly. And after a long time, decades of city planners going to the city council and saying, this is not sustainable. It's not that you can't upkeep the roads. You can upkeep the roads, but the city is growing, and it's going to reach a ceiling where it can't grow anymore as long as these things are here. The only way to avoid that is to suppress these arteries. Take these elevated roadways and suppress them so they are running under the city and this space is open for development on the ground level. That was called the Big Dig. I remember seeing initial hypothetical plans for the Big Dig and thinking, there's no way you can do this. No way at all. Because what you're planning to do here is literally reshape 60% of Boston while keeping Boston a working city. With 2 million people commuting into town every day to go to work and then commuting back out at the end of that day. You might be able to do this if you convinced everybody in the city to sort of move away, like Rockridge in Blazing Saddles. If you convinced everybody in the city to move away, and your engineers had the free run of the city, you might be able to do this in 10 years. But you can't possibly do it and keep the city working at the same time. I was, of course, wrong. The Big Dig happened. It worked. The short-term effects were the mother of all headaches, just unbelievably bad. But the short-term effects, the long-term effects, are lovely. Boston is just indisputably improved as a living experience, as an experience to live in the city. It's just indisputably improved by not only the main Big Dig, but by all the satellite efforts as well. A lot of the elevated highways that were adjacent to that huge elevated highway that just cut through the city were also taken down, including one right in my immediate neighborhood that used to be, for years and years, it was just an awful, dripping, rusting eyesore. It had traffic running all day on it, day and night. Had homeless people shooting up underneath the bridges, the overpasses that I had to walk with my dogs. I was on ground level, so I had to skirt those encampments all the time. And it was just a snarling, awful mess. And it prevented this whole area from looking good. And I remember seeing plans, Big Dig adjacent plans. I remember seeing, I have quite a few old friends who are in the city government here in Boston. They all look like me, but they didn't go into books. They went into apparatchik work. And I saw plans for what was going to happen in this area. And I was staggered. The same thing as with Big Dig. I thought, what? You're going to tear that overpass down? There's no way you can do that. How are you supposed to do that and still keep the traffic moving? They managed. City planners know how to do this. Civic engineers know how to do this. They managed. That overpass, that rusting, horrible overpass, is a long, distant memory now. And the area all around there is beautiful. Green grass, sloping hills, still plenty of traffic, but no eyesores. Trees everywhere, greenery everywhere, easier movement for the traffic everywhere, just entirely better. And that all happened after this book. So, you could make another one of these. These things, there'll always be a market for this. The book before this was Boston, An Architectural History by Walter Muir Whitehill. That was a Boston book that I sold 1 million copies of. That, again, looked at Boston through its architecture. The architecture through time. But another reason why I got this book will be familiar to some of you from my Brattle trips, and that is the Yankee Clipper. He must have owned this book because he filled it with clippings. Just filled it. Look at all these things. They're all through here. Clippings of every kind. There's my beloved Bates Hall. Clippings of every kind. They're on every page here. Just all through here. Those of you who might be tuning in brand new, the Brattle is a used bookstore in the heart of downtown Boston. And the Yankee Clipper is my name for the previous owner of a whole bunch of books who did the same thing with all of them. Clipped out any kind of newspaper clipping that was in any way adjacent to the book under review, and just carefully trimmed them. He dated them, and then he put them all in here. Put them all in the book. And I guess he must have died, because all of his books are at the Brattle now, and they're all going out into the sale lot. It's not like there was any kind of, Yankee Clipper Memorial Library that went on intact to somebody else. Nope. That's not going to happen to your books either. Just make your peace with it. They'll be boxed up, sent to the nearest thrift store if they're lucky. If not, they'll just be thrown away, nearest landfill or whatever. I've been told that I think it was Mark Richardson who told me you can't really just willy-nilly do that, because a lot of these books have a particular kind of glue in them that is hazardous. You can't just throw them away in a landfill. You have to sort of pay professionals to take them away. that's going to happen. Some variation of that's going to happen to you, and it happened to the Yankee Clipper. So I'm always honored when I find a book of his that I really want, that is full of his clippings. I've done it a few times now, and the clippings are uniformly well chosen and interesting. So I'm always happy to give an extra home to his books for a few more years. So there you go. That was the Brattle. That was a Brattle trip, a post-heatwave Brattle trip. As we have Cityscapes of Boston. For the first time, finally, I own a copy of this book. We have The Ice at the End of the World, 2019 progress report about Greenland. We have Oliver Wendell Holmes, the latest biography of Oliver Wendell Holmes. We have Things We Lost to the Water, a debut novel, with an attractive American cover. We have Universe 2 by Robert Silverberg and Karen Haber. We have The Curious Life of Robert Hooke by Lisa Jardine. Let's see here. We have A True History of the United States. How much truth there will be remains to be seen. We have The Year of Our Love, a long-term, on and off again love story. We have Phoenix by D.H. Lawrence, a collection of his nonfiction work. And we have Irish Portraits by the great Liam O'Flaherty. Very thin thing, a very thin collection of his short stories. But I'll take it as a placeholder until I can find a really fat collection of his short stories. And that's it. That's it for the Brattle. Like I mentioned, the heat is predicted to go back up this week, not to the heat wave levels that it was at before, but still pretty hot. So I'm not sure how often I will be going back to the Brattle. I have a few other treats in store for you this week, but I don't know that the Brattle will be one of them. If I go, of course, you'll be the first to know. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.